most important part of my biography that was left out is the fact that I'm a Jersey boy. I was born and lived in New Jersey most of my life. Actually, I was a United States attorney in New Jersey from 90 to 94, and I used to come back and forth along this corridor when we did investigations or cases in Trenton. So I'm very familiar with this area. I got into the area of cybersecurity back in 2007 when the then Director of National Intelligence, Michael McConnell, and the Director of NSA, Keith Alexander, brought me into a series of sessions, very obviously classified, to learn a lot about what was going on in the world of cyber. Because obviously most of my focus on Homeland Security had been on the physical world in the wake of September 11th. Out of that series of sessions, we developed a strategy called the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, which in the beginning of 2008 was presented to President Bush. He signed off on it. It was launched. At the time it was signed, it was classified. The Obama administration has since declassified it, so you can look at it. And it was the first effort to take a comprehensive approach to the issue of cybersecurity. The impetus for this was the clear recognition that not only are we daily losing huge amounts of intellectual property, but that the threat to our economy and maybe even to our well-being from a cyber attack is every bit as serious potentially as a weapon of mass destruction. But our capability and our doctrine in dealing with this is far behind what our capability and doctrine is with respect to conventional or even unconventional weapons. So the idea was to try to organize ourselves to move forward. And as I'm going to talk to you about this morning or this afternoon, it has been a challenging road, one in which I think we've made some progress, not as much as I would like to see, and I'd like to talk a little bit about why I think that is and what it is we need to do. From your standpoint, I think, though, for those of you who are in the business, you're faced with a conundrum. And this is something I see all the time in my current work when we do consulting work and investment advisory work in a number of security areas, including cyber. And here's the problem. You have a lot of technological know-how, creativity, and imagination. But if you go and develop tools and capabilities and you want to sell them to somebody, you're coming to somebody with a solution, but that person doesn't really know what the problem is. So you miss each other. I used to see this at DHS. People would come up with a thing. They'd say, here's a great thing. Buy it. We'd go, well, what's it supposed to address? What's the problem? And so the inability to have clearly defined requirements make it very difficult to come up with capabilities and solutions. On the other hand, the government, which is as a major customer, would be very important in setting requirements, hasn't really figured out what those requirements are. And part of it is because we don't really have a fully developed doctrine about exactly what the threats are and who should be responsible for them. Partly because it is a very dynamic process of dealing with threats, unlike the kind of things that you face when you're building an aircraft, where you can pretty much understand the threats and the doctrine, and the process of developing the requirements and meeting them can take place over years. In this area, things are happening all the time. So the normal requirement setting process is difficult. There are two other obstacles to getting the requirement process down in a way that would be helpful to those who are providing the technology. One is many of those who set the requirements are unfamiliar with and uncomfortable with the engineering domain in which activity is taking place. They don't really understand it. It's easy to understand how bombers work and missiles work. It's a little harder to scope out and understand the various domains of cyber attacks and cyber conflict. And so that makes the requirement process difficult. The third element, which is an obstacle, is the legal architecture. We live in a world where our legal architecture for governing the policies and the authorities of the government and the private sector are based on 20th century technology. For example, electronic surveillance is built around a concept of telephone communication where people have fixed landlines. You dialed a number that was, routed you to where you were going, and then the actual call itself transmitted over the line was the content. So when we built the law of electronic surveillance, it was easy to say, okay, we're going to have one level of protection, pretty low level protection for things like the number you're dialing and who the subscriber is. And we're going to have much more robust protection for what the content is. Now here's the problem. In the world of the internet, that distinction between the address and the subscriber information and the content has become erased. It's very difficult. If you're looking for malicious code in packets, you may look at things in the metadata, you may look at things in the payload. And if you're looking at things in the payload, the conventional wisdom is you're looking at content. And that means there's a very cumbersome and difficult set of legal problems you have to resolve. And yet the reality is, when you're scanning large amounts of payload to look for malicious code, you're not really intercepting communicative content in the way we think about it. You're not interested in what Alice is telling Bob. What you're interested in is whether in that stream of digits there is a certain slice of digits that is there for some reason other than to convey the communication. And so the legal architecture, which applies in 20th century telephony, does not apply in the internet. So those are all the obstacles we have to getting ourselves organized with a much more fluid requirement capability building continuum that would help us develop a lot of this technology. So how do we change that? Well, I would say we face a couple of problems. First, and I'm going to discuss them briefly, there has been a lot of publicity, particularly of late, about the nature of the threat. But I will tell you that there are many people who still do not really believe that cybersecurity is that much of a priority. Some people describe it as an overblown process. And I would have said a couple of years ago that the difficulty was that much of it wasn't public, and therefore people didn't know about it. But I actually now think we face a little bit of the reverse problem. Much of it is becoming public. In fact, to be careful on the way down in the train today, I made sure to check on my laptop or on my iPad to see if there were new developments today in cybersecurity. It turned out that the Italian cyber police had been hacked, and that had been announced this morning. So there's a flood of these kinds of episodes that are being described. And here's the psychological problem. You know how when you boil a lobster, if you boil it slowly, the lobster doesn't really know it's getting boiled? That's what we have in cybersecurity. We're getting boiled, but it's slowly. People are reading about all these incursions and problems, and they look around. The sky hasn't fallen. The planes aren't falling out of the sky. So they figure, not that big a problem. So that's a publicity issue or a public relations issue that we have to confront if we're going to move the ball forward on cybersecurity. The second problem is, again, it's and I plead guilty to this as well, it's a consequence of the tendency we have to believe that technology is a magic bullet, and therefore that there's some engineering solution. If the engineers just get about it, we'll have an answer to the problem. And I think in the area of cybersecurity, many people, including many policymakers, conceive of the challenge of cybersecurity as we haven't built a good enough Maginot Line. We don't have a big enough firewall that will capture everything. And if one of you folks would just invent that widget, that software or that hardware, we'd be done with the problem. And in many ways, that again is another thought obstacle to dealing with this challenge, because I don't think that it is in fact possible to build a Maginot Line or a single solution. But the quest for that has made it very difficult to get people organized around breaking the problems into manageable bite sizes and recognizing there's a series of answers. There's not a single answer, and you've got to be able to look across the entire system and figure out what the right answer is to the right part of the problem. So I think these are the challenges we have in terms of moving the discussion forward. Let me review what we have seen in the last few years. And I'm only doing a partial list. You know, we've had major fraud episodes. I remember when I was the secretary, we announced a major case against people who had surreptitiously captured, I think, 41 million credit card numbers by war driving and downloading and capturing off the wireless communication. credit cards from the patrons or the customers of some of the major retailers in the United States, and they made millions of dollars doing that. That kind of criminal fraud has been a very significant feature of what goes on. At the same time, we continue to see efforts to get our intellectual property, and someone has said that every year the equivalent of far more than the Library of Congress in intellectual property is being stolen from the United States and from our companies and being sold or being retrieved by companies or countries overseas. Very recently, Lockheed Martin announced an intrusion that, again, is symptomatic of the fact that these are rich targets. And it's not just about the business. It's about the major intellectual capital and natural intellectual resources of this country. And this is not a theoretical issue about how this could happen. It is happening, and we probably haven't measured the full dimensions. We've had the challenge of people actually hacking into security companies to steal or disable the tools that others rely on for security. Of course, the recent example of this was the RSA division of EMC, which had itself victimized, and which now has at least raised serious questions about the vulnerability of those enterprises that have relied upon those products for purposes of their own remote access into security. HP Gary is another company that announced it was hacked into. In terms of nation states, in 2007, the country of Estonia suffered several days of debilitating attacks on the government systems and on the financial systems as an effort was made to really bring the country to its knees. Who was responsible for that? Well, the Estonians believed it was the Russians because it was precipitated by a political dispute between the Russian-speaking residents of Estonia and the government. The Russian government denied that it was them. They blamed it on activists and criminals. But of course, we know that sometimes that's just a question of deniability. But there's no doubt that the issue of attribution or the difficulty of making attribution has made this difficult. In 2008, when the Russians invaded Georgia, unlike the old days when you had an artillery barrage before the invasion, you had a cyber barrage. There was a cyber attack on the command and control systems that was designed to disable or to hamper the Georgian response. So this is, again, now we've moved away from fraud and intellectual property theft into the domain of denial of service attacks, which are disruptive, and really even into those areas where you could have a destructive attack. There was widely reported in the newspaper the Stuxnet worm, and you can read the newspaper reports. I can't tell you whether they're true or not, but again, if you accept them for the sake of argument, that suggests the ability to actually destroy an operating or control system in a way that would be, if it were done on a large scale, potentially very disruptive to critical infrastructure in a country. And finally, most recently, and in a funny way perhaps gotten the most public attention, has been the rise of hacktivism launched by various groups that are either motivated by a political grievance. For example, the attack on PayPal by Anonymous in response to the fact that PayPal was acting in a way that was inimical to WikiLeaks. Or you have LulzSec, and these things are metastasizing. And there, again, it's a combination of ideology, but there's no guarantee that that ideology doesn't mask either criminality or even efforts at espionage. So there's a whole wide range of phenomena we're seeing out there. And basically what it is breaking down to is these various categories. Classic criminality, fraud, ideologically motivated anarchistic types of attacks, hacktivism, exploitation of intellectual property or theft of national security secrets, disruptive efforts like denial of service, and then perhaps most important and most significant and most difficult, the advanced persistent threats which raise the specter of an actual destructive attack, something that would destroy our operating systems and our control systems, and in a certain circumstance could become part of a major national or global conflict. So we've got to deal with a lot of different threats. And the reason I lay them out there is because in many ways there are different solution sets to those threats. They don't all have one solution set, nor is it clear to me that one particular actor or even the public sector, the private sector ought to be responsible for all of them. In fact, it's my contention that what we need to do is to break down the threats and the consequences, look at what are the most critical, determine where we think the responsibility ought to lie, and that's a function first of capability, but it's also a function of some political judgments we have to make. Do we want the U.S. government sitting on everybody's network, looking at everything that goes through? That might raise some challenging civil liberties issues. Or do we want to move to a pure free market model? Some people argue let the market take care of itself. I would argue that's not realistic because there's a market failure when it comes to cybersecurity. The market failure is this. No rational enterprise will spend $1 more on its own security than the value of the enterprise itself. And yet, if you are an enterprise in a critical piece of infrastructure and you fail, the consequences are not just the destruction of the enterprise, but the destruction of many enterprises. So the market's not going to internalize the risk. And that requires some regulatory, some legislative act to make sure that we are properly balancing. So you got a wide array of different tools, market-based solutions, incentive solutions, regulatory solutions, and in some case, direct government intervention. And we've got to figure out what the right answers are for the right sets of problems. I would also argue that we've got to consider the kinds of consequences that we would put the highest priority on. It may be that while fraud is a very, very big problem economically to the country, because the victims are so widely distributed, and by the way, there was a recent report that small businesses actually are the victims of over half the intrusions that go on. We tend to think of the big players, but small businesses become victims as well. It may be that the only way to allocate responsibility and capability there is a model that maybe isn't the most robust, but is sufficiently capable and sufficiently affordable and sufficiently acceptable and understandable that you could offer on a wide basis to small businesses. At the other end of the scale, when you deal with the most sophisticated defense companies, it's probably both as a consequence matter and as a capability matter easier to require or to at least assist them to manage a defense against a much wider scale of attacks. So we've got to look at some of those issues too. So I've laid out the problem, and let me say where I think we are with it. Shortly after coming to office, President Obama talked about the importance of cybersecurity in a speech that he made, and he assigned one of his National Security Council staffers to do a review of the comprehensive national cybersecurity initiative. And she completed that review in 60 days or 90 days, and it essentially ratified the basic approach of the initiative, which is to deal across the spectrum, everything from defense, including what they call active defense, which is the ability to actually prevent things, to education, to supply chain focuses, and to all kinds of intermediate steps in terms of research to help enable us and increase our capabilities. Where that has moved since then has been a little bit fitful. I would say that we've seen a series of releases in the last 3 or 4 months from various agencies of the government that have begun to attack strategically some parts of the problem. For example, the State Department issued something on international cybersecurity, and they talked about the need to have begin to work on workable arrangements with other countries, both in terms of policing the internet and in terms of having mechanisms for responding if it looks like there may be an attack underway. The Department of Homeland Security, my old department, issued a proposal for legislation, which is now before the Congress, that laid out what I think are some useful elements of what a partial solution might be. These include having immunities for people who take certain steps, incentives to protect information sharing and to make sure that information isn't disseminated inappropriately, requirements that critical infrastructure, although they leave this undefined, be mandated to put together protection plans for cybersecurity, and that those be reviewed by independent third parties. But again, here I would argue perhaps what is lacking is an enforcement mechanism. What do you do if someone doesn't produce a plan or if the plan is not capable. But at least what these do is they move somewhat down the track of allowing us to more easily share information, create liability protection that encourages taking action and discourages complacency, and also creates a mechanism for sharing best practices. By the way, one thing not addressed in the legislation is a huge barrier to sharing information, which is the fact that the intelligence community, which has a lot of insight into what is out there, is generally very, very constrained in dealing with domestic matters. And although I think the proposed legislation would allow opening that aperture to some degree, I would argue again, we have tools in the toolbox we are not fully using because we haven't fully integrated some of what is known in the defense world and the intelligence world with what is going on in the civilian world. On another front, however, there is a little bit of progress even on that problem. The Department of Defense recently issued its cybersecurity strategy, or at least part one of the strategy. And part of that is the public announcement of a pilot for the Defense Industrial Base, which allows a certain amount of sharing of information from the intelligence and defense community with those companies that are actually part of providing contract technology to the Defense Department in the aerospace and technology area. And again, this is an effort to begin to allow at least some of what the government is able to determine might not have happened yet, but might be coming down the pike, and to share that with some enterprises in the private sector so they can look for those kinds of tools or look for those kinds of originations as part of building their layers of defense. So we're partway there. I'm going to argue that there's one piece that hasn't been developed, and I think it may be in the works, but I'm not sure. What is our national doctrine about attacks? When do we get to the point that we allow a response that's not merely playing defense like a hockey player with a stick trying to block the puck, but actually says maybe we're going to take out the opposing hockey player or break his stick? I've had people in the private sector come to me and say, we could actually go, when someone penetrates and takes something, we can actually go and get it back and disable the platform that attacks us, but we're not sure we're allowed to do it. So there's a lot of unsettled law and policy and strategy about the degree to which you can extend what we might call active defense outside of the boundaries of your own network and maybe outside the boundaries of your own country. And again, until that is settled, it's going to be hard for people who are creating the tools and techniques to know what kinds of tools and techniques might be required out there. So this is, again, a piece of unfinished business. But having laid that out, let me leave you with before I take questions, leave you with two general areas where I think I can sketch where some of the requirements are going to be in the future, or at least should be in the future in terms of developing what we are producing. First, what are the kinds of threats we're going to have to be able to deal with, and what are the kind of mechanisms we're going to need to have? As I said earlier, the Maginot Line, the firewall, is not a sufficient solution, even though I think most people still think that's what the answer is. The truth is the firewall only detects that which you are looking for, or which you can either, by dint of advanced knowledge of a signature or an IP address, or some anomalies in traffic detection in terms of what's coming in, you have to have a heads up or a red flag that something's coming in. That doesn't help you with zero-day exploits. Therefore, as someone I know has said, you've got to live in the network. A lot of the technological response to penetrations and exfiltrations involve having a very good ability to monitor in real time what is on your network and to be able to analyze and assess it, both in real time and then sometimes retrospectively. That brings us, and I know this is part of what's been talked about here today, that brings us to a series of challenges. Sensors. How do we monitor in real time what's going on? What kind of software do we need? Is hardware part of the solution? How do we accumulate and collect and condense and compress that data so we can hold it for a period of time, although I know what that period of time is open to debate. How do we then manage the data? This is what people are calling the big data problem. How do we filter it, analyze it, catalog it, and be able to focus on what we care about within a period of time that makes it actionable. This is, by the way, not a unique problem to cyber. It's a problem that's dealt with in a wide variety of areas involving war fighting, which I can't go into here. But it's part of a bigger problem. How do you analyze huge amounts of data? We are better now at collecting than we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But the problem is when you collect it, you got to do something with it. And in many ways, the worst of all worlds is to collect something and not make use of it. That's the 9/11 problem. You have the data, but you just haven't brought it together and analyzed it. So that's clearly going to be part of the problem. Another area is going to be how do you manage this process for enterprises that are all but the most sophisticated. Yes, there are some companies that particularly in the advanced technology and defense space, that are quite capable of using sophisticated tools on their own networks and integrating them with their cyber defenses. The problem is most enterprises aren't. And people come at them with a lot of different tools, and they need somebody who can come in and help them understand what is appropriate for their use, what's the upside and the downside. And the key is you don't want to ingest more than you can digest. So again, I believe in the end there's going to be an opportunity for those enterprises that can manage security services, and particularly those that can have visibility across a lot of clients, because as you know, your ability to detect and analyze and understand is directly proportional to the amount of data you're seeing. If you're protecting one enterprise, you're seeing a lot less than if you're protecting 1,000 enterprises. So that's another opportunity. Supply chain. You know, we get the hardware and the software. Who on earth knows where it all comes from? Very little of it has a provenance that we can track back to the chip level. And yet we know from experience that hardware and software are vulnerable to people who want to embed things in them that can then be activated later. How do we build capabilities to vet that hardware or software? And it's very difficult in a global environment, and we need to come up with some solutions for that. I've not yet heard of a perfect forensic tool that is able to do all those things. And finally, and maybe most profoundly, the insider threat. Although engineers like to think a lot about the hard technological problem, many of the problems are self-inflicted. There was a piece written by the Deputy Defense Secretary in 2008, I think it was, maybe 2009, in Foreign Affairs, where he disclosed and declassified the fact that one of the most serious attacks on the U.S. military defense system occurred because somebody picked up a thumb drive and stuck it in their laptop on a non-classified network, and then it metastasized over everything that was connected. Now that wasn't a question of a firewall, that was a question of somebody unwittingly putting something in the tent. And I read a story in the newspaper, and by the way, the reason I preface everything with I read it in the paper, it was made public, is because I'm not telling you anything classified. That's out of bounds. I read a story in the paper that said that the government had run a test where they left like little thumb drives in parking lots and like in various public areas, and waited to see how many people would pick them up and use them. And they were able to tell because presumably there was something in the thumb drive that beaconed. And something like 60% of the people picked them up and used them. And if it was a logo, it was 90%. So if somebody took like Nixon and they just stuck it on a thumb drive, like 90% of people would stick it in the thing. I was at a security conference recently, and my wife was there, and she came back with a goodie bag and had the thumb drive in it. So I said, just throw it out. But you know, but I have to say, even I hesitated for a minute because, you know, we're all conditioned. It's free. It's not free. It comes with a heavy cost. So how do you deal with this? Well, you know, I mean, some of it is what they call computer hygiene. You have to train people. But I'll tell you something else. You've got to build a security architecture for how people authenticate themselves that takes account of the actual psychological reality of human beings. When people come up and say, here's a perfect solution, you have to, you know, in order to log on, you have to scrape and test your DNA, and then you have to have a 43-character password, which you change every other day. That is very robust, but it's not going to work. How do you build authentication and similar rules that are actually workable in real life? I'll give you one quick example, which I thought was ingenious. I had to do something online, And in order to be, once you signed on, you had to be able to come back to it. And in order to have a password, they didn't give you a password or tell you to select a password. And they didn't even do what a lot of banks do, which is they ask you for your mother's maiden name or this or that. What they did is they had golden questions. And maybe some of you have experienced this. They said, you pick the question and write the question down and you pick the answer. Now that is brilliant because what it does is it dramatically expands the number of variables. Everybody knows about the mother's maiden name, but not everybody knows that people are going to put down what their first high school sweetheart's name was, let alone find that. And yet it's easy to remember because it takes account of human nature, that if you let people pick what they're going to remember, they're going to remember it. So again, I throw that out there because that's not a tech solution, but it is a very psychologically skillful solution. Finally, before I take questions, let me conclude with this. I would argue that the approach we take in cybersecurity is the approach we take in physical security, a risk-managed, layered approach. What that means is this: there isn't going to be a magic bullet. The stories of the type you see where somebody has a tool and the tool gets bypassed does not mean the tool failed. No tool is going to work 100% of the time. What you're going to want to do in cyber, as you do in real life, is to build layers of security, recognizing that the more layers you have, the harder it'll be to bypass all of them. And that multi-layered approach, if we can fix our heads around that, we will actually succeed because we won't be asking too much of our capabilities and we can set requirements that can be more easily met. We're going to have to look at not only blocking, but awareness. And not only awareness, but hygiene. And not only hygiene, but resilience. These are the basic layers of cyber defense. And if we can invest in all of those, and if the government can get itself, complete the process, and frankly the commercial sector, of scoping out exactly how it wants to develop a doctrine, then I think we'll have a set of requirements that our ingenuity and our capabilities can meet. So, this is a very exciting area to be in. And I think it's one in which this country has to take a second seat to nobody. But we do have to make some decisions. And I'm hopeful that over the next year or two, particularly if there's a lot of pressure from the private sector, we can get Congress to do some things that would be helpful. We can get the administration to complete what they've begun, I think, in a very promising way. And we can get about, in a more intelligent and disciplined way, building the tools we need to protect ourselves. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.